Tolpuddle. So I'd like to welcome you to this session, and it's all change for food production. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers. So I'll introduce those as I bring them on to speak. Unfortunately, Bev Clarkson from Unite is not able to join us. Bev's had a wisdom tooth out yesterday, so hopefully, Bev, that you're listening in and you're not in too much discomfort. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on our first panel speaker. It's Luke Pollard, the MP for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, and also the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And anybody who knows Luke is a great campaigner, not only for his own constituency, but for the whole of the Southwest. So over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us. Food should be more political. That's my starting point for the remarks I'm going to make today. It seems that over the past 10 years in particular, food policy, both in terms of production, nutritional value, where it comes from, has either been outsourced to the private sector, and by private sector, what I largely mean is supermarkets, Tesco's, or it's been captured in this Brexit debate, which has meant that we've been attacked with sound bites, not with the detail of what's going on. I think on the left, we've got this enormous possibility now to make food more political, not necessarily more party political, but something that's further up the political or order of things, further up discussion in the media, further up an importance for our party and for our movement. And I think one thing that I want you to get from my remarks on this one here is that this is something that needs to happen right across the Labour movement. We've seen some amazing work from the Co-op Party recently about food justice. We've seen some amazing work from our trade union colleagues about standing up for people who work in food production, both on the land, both in food factories, on front line during the pandemic in supermarkets and retail, and in haulage and distribution as well. And in Parliament, Labour MPs have been leading the case to preserve our high food and farming standards from being undercut in future trade deals. Now, all of this matters because each and every one of us should be eating 3 healthy, nutritious meals every single day. Normally, when I do these talks, it's in the evening and it's about 7:30. And one thing that's always on my mind when that happens is at that time, there are kids in Plymouth, where I represent, and right across our country who are going to bed hungry because their families can't afford to put healthy food on their table, can't afford food, can't afford the utilities to cook the food. And as we saw from the start of the pandemic, many families don't even have a table, a kitchen table for the family to come around, or from their kids to work from home when the schools were closed during the pandemic. Food should be more political. We should care more about what happens in food. And we've got an amazing panel of speakers here, and I'm really keen to hear what they have to say because they come from very different perspectives. But I just want to offer a few thoughts about why food should be more political and how it can be along the way. As a movement, we talk about food poverty quite a lot, and food poverty is really important. But food poverty is not about a shortage of food. Britain has more than enough food to feed everyone, 3 healthy, nutritious meals a day, ensuring that every single person in our country can eat a healthy meal. The problem is there are far too many people in our country who are in a state of desperate poverty, unable to afford their bills, unable to put food on the table for their families. And so food poverty is a consequence of poverty. And when we're talking about food, we need to be really clear about why it's important that healthy, nutritious food is readily available, of course, why it's important that food prices remain low. And historically, food prices are low compared to the amount of household income that's spent on it, and low compared to many of our G7, G20 global competitors. But there are still people that can't afford to feed themselves and their families. So it's a matter of poverty, and we must be relentless in that pursuit of poverty. Johnny Reynolds, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, has made a series of statements about this, talking about a need to preserve that £20 uplift in universal credit. I don't think it's something that the Tories should be taking away. It's cruel and inhumane at a time when there's so many people are genuinely struggling. But also we shouldn't fall into the trap that allows the Conservatives to brand universal credit as an out of work benefit. Huge numbers on universal credit are in work. And the bargain that we used to have that says if you're in work, you'll be able to afford to pay your bills, to have a home, to feed your family, has broken down. And we need to rebuild that bargain, rebuild that deal for policies on the left. I want to talk briefly about trade deals as well, because as a movement, the left often talks about people that work in food as those people who work in factories, those people who work in food distribution, those people who work in supermarkets, and they are important, and you'll be hearing from representatives shortly. But we must also not forget those primary producers, the people that work on the land, our farmers. Now, since the 1947 Agriculture Act, which I'm sure you all remember very well, there's been largely a consensus between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party about the big picture items about farming. We might disagree about farming methods, especially about animal welfare on the land, but generally speaking, that big picture has been agreed. But that's changed. The Conservatives have moved off that consensus because of their position on Brexit. They want to see more food imported into the UK, grown abroad. And that food is often grown to lower animal welfare, lower environmental, and lower workplace standards. That food, when sold in the UK, undercuts our farmers, undercuts our high food and farming standards. And yes, I'm sure there's people on the call who want to see our food and farming standards go higher, and I'm one of those. But we don't preserve high standards by allowing food produced to lower standards to undercut them. We know that that will put farmers out of business. We know that the Conservatives want to reduce the total number of farmers, moving more farms to be industrialised, aggregated, bigger, using new technologies such as gene editing and industrial production. Now, there's real concerns around some of those areas here, a real concern. I'm also worried about the attack on small family farms, which are the backbone of production, not just in the West Country where I represent, but right across our country as well. That should matter to all of us, because if we're relying on food produced to lower standards abroad, we're not only offshoring the carbon intensity, because generally speaking, food is more carbon intensive for some of those larger markets, Australia, America, Brazil, Argentina in particular, but we're also offshoring responsibility for the workers that work in that production, for lower standard production. And I think as on the left, we need to be absolutely clear that we back our British farmers, we back our high food and farming standards, and we won't see them undercut. I want to see more food grown in Britain, not only because it creates more local jobs, but because it cuts carbon. And the idea that our future food supply is going to be coming from the other side of the planet at a point of climate and ecological crisis is just a ridiculous idea. The floods that we saw yesterday in Germany, Belgium, and Holland really need to be a wake-up call to the need for us to take greener action, bolder action, and do so now, not only to cut carbon, but to be more resilient. We're not going to do that if we import food from the other side of the planet. It really isn't. Now, on the left, I think there's some really incredible and exciting ideas around food. I think Ian Byrne, the Labour MP in Liverpool, who's championing a right to food, is doing enormous credit to our movement, making the case for a right to food, just as Labour's also making the case for a right to breathe clean air. I think there's an enormous potential around the rights agenda for some of the basics, because as a movement, I think we might have taken some of those basics for granted, assuming that food, clean air, water will be accessible to all indefinitely, and it's not. You know that. So that rights agenda, I think, is exciting, and I want to encourage our friends from the trade union movement, from the cooperative movement, from Labour members, from our wider left family to start contributing to that. It's not enough that we make nicer food banks. We have to have a bold plan to remove the need for food banks, to make sure that food is healthier all the time. And even though he was appointed by a set of Tories, Henry Dimbleby's food report is actually all right as starting a debate on this. But we need to make sure that debate is not just between supermarkets and consumers. We need to make sure that the voice of people who work in this sector are not lost as well. Because we saw from COVID and the large number of outbreaks of COVID in food production, sometimes the conditions, the workplace practices are not what we need. Food should be more political. Next time you're buying some food in a supermarket, in a cafe or a restaurant, have a think about how it got there. Have a think about the carbon intensity, the water, the travel. Our food's done more traveling in the last year than we have, guaranteed, right? And so think about where it's come from and the standards of the people that are working in, to bring food to our plate, because actually there's enormous amounts of things that's broken in our food system at the moment, and we need a bold approach to do that. I'm leading Labour's rural review, looking at Labour's rural policies, which includes our farming and countryside activities. But I want to hear from the movement itself to make the case that food should be more political, and we should not be comfortable in any way with this broken system that we have. That's probably enough from me, Nick, but really keen to hear the rest of the speakers on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. A brilliant contribution, which has set the scene, really, I think, for the rest of the debate we've got today. Climate, Brexit, workers' rights and food poverty. You know, this will be the theme that runs throughout this debate, I'm sure. Next, I'd like to introduce David Emery. David's a Unite shop steward at Two Sisters Poultry Factory in Deeside in North Wales, working at the sharp end. David's going to share with us his experience of working in food manufacturing during the COVID pandemic. So you're very welcome, David. I'm looking forward to hear you speak. Unfortunately, we're being foiled by technology. We'll hopefully get David on at some point after that brilliant introduction from me as well. So I'd like now to go to Dr. Charlie Clutterbuck. Charlie, if you'd like to address the debate, please.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. And what I'd like to say is to pick up on what Luke was saying, that food should be more political. And I'd like to flesh out some of the points Luke was making. We're in for some of the biggest changes in food and farming for perhaps 70 years, perhaps even 170 years. The biggest changes occurred, latest changes occurred in the 80s when a certain Mrs. Thatcher tried to get rid of school meals, basically said, let the markets rule. So that was let the supermarkets rule. A lot of the agricultural research, which I was involved with, 3/4 of that has been shut since then. And the free advisory service has gone. But what that has meant more so is that since the 80s, we used to produce about 75% of our food ourselves. We now produce about 50% of our food since that time. So I've seen my science almost disappear in the last 30 years. So what I'd much prefer is that we look back further to the big changes of the Labour Agricultural Act that Luke mentioned. And he said there was a consensus then about the way farming was done. And that consensus involved maintaining decent prices for farmers at relatively cheap prices for consumers. And it was discussed in Parliament every year what prices would be set for bread and wheat and for milk. And I think we need to go back to thinking in that way rather than just letting the markets rule. So at that point, the Labour also introduced the whole idea of investing in agriculture, and they invested as much in agriculture as probably the NHS. And I would like to see a comparison with the NHS, that let's talk about good food at the point of consumption. But it might be we're going back even further to the repeal of the Corn Laws. And this is what worries me most, is that when the Corn Laws were repealed, the following nearly 100 years saw a massive rundown in British agriculture. Lots of farms around here went to the walls, and all of that was caused by us building ships, freezer ships in Belfast, etc., to go out across the world to bring in food from around the world. In particular, we nicked seeds and swapped them all over the world to set up plantations, which meant cheap labour on cheap land, bringing in cheap food, such that by the beginning of the First World War, we were only producing 1/4 of our own food. And that relic is still with us, because you remember I said half of our food is being imported. That has a disproportionate effect on the environment. It means that 70% of the land used to produce the food is abroad, and 66% of our greenhouse gases to make our food is abroad. And yet nobody talks about that. That's why Luke's dead right. We need to talk about much more about producing food locally. We do much more for the environment. But the signs are that this is not going to happen. that basically is lining up about the farms versus finance. And I'm afraid that when Johnson says he wants to beautify the landscape, which he said in Parliament, that's going to do absolutely nothing for rural lives. But as I'll show you in a minute, it is going to be very nice for the city and the finance people, because they're literally rubbing their hands at what could be going on very shortly. So I see increasingly this battle between farm and finance. They keep talking about doing stuff for the environment. They call it a greening Brexit, and I heard lots of talk about soil health, which is obviously right up my lane, because that's my specialist. But look at that map of Britain there. That is the soil being washed into the sea. We're losing 3 million tons of our most valuable resource. 2 million are going into the North Sea and about 1 million into the Irish Sea, but I don't hear anybody talking about it. The soil health was promised, but when the Soil Association tried to get subsidies to improve soil health, DEFRA said, no, soil health is not a public good. They kept on going on about public money for public goods. Said, no, it's not a public good, it's a private asset. It's a private asset which public goods may flow from. And they're right, because most of that land, remember, is privately owned. We don't have control over that land. We can't say what should happen to that land. So this is what's going on. They're not doing much for the environment. This is what I was involved in. The subsidies have been cut, and some of that money is being paid to consultants to come up with great landscaping schemes. And I'm involved in one of them, which was trying to develop natural flood management. We were turned down. We didn't get it. We knew we wouldn't get it, because this is who's getting it. All those characters which are talking about carbon offsets. Basically, they want to use the countryside to create carbon, which is then used as a credit to sell on the markets to industry, who can then claim they have zero emissions. They're not going to clean themselves up. They're just going to buy these carbon credits. So you can see already around here, the small farms, which Luke said are really under threat. I think they're on their way to the slaughterhouses around here. That they're going to be bought up, and tracts of land are going to be turned into forest, which can then be sold on the finances. So I really think we're heading for Empire 2.0, as it's being called, which is where, as Luke said, the subsidies are going. They're fighting to maintain the standards, but with lack of success. The one tariff which has changed so far is that 250,000 tons of raw sugarcane is now going to be allowed into the country without any tariff on it. The beneficiaries of that is Tate and Lyle, and they are owned by an American sugar refining company. So the £100 million which would have been paid in tax, which the EU used to take, which we in Britain could have taken, has gone straight to an American multinational. And that is a microcosm of what is going to happen in the future. As Luke said, these trade deals are going to bring more cheap food in. Every one of them is talking about cheap food. So what does this, who is going to suffer most from this rush to produce a lot more cheap food to feed the masses? And as Luke said, we know the answer to that. It's going to be farmers, especially small farmers, food workers and farm workers. They're all going to be on that treadmill even faster than they are now, because of the threats of cheap food. And that clearly is what this government wants. It's going to use the countryside to make carbon, sell that on the markets, and bring in cheap food. And so it's just like the repeal of the Corn Laws, cheap food for the masses, at the benefit now not just of industrialists, but also the finance sector. I published this book, thanks to commissioned by Unite last year, a couple of years ago, where I suggested we use the subsidies, the £3 billion of subsidies, to pay workers, and we pay the workers to produce good local food near the centres of civilization, if you like, the towns and the cities. So you can imagine around here, we could produce lots of more fruit, lots more veg, and the animals to feed directly to the towns and the cities. And that sets up a circular economy which could save us over £30 billion in imports. Okay, that's where I'll finish.
Thanks, Charlie. That's fascinating stuff there. And I think, as Luke said in his contribution, politicising food is going to be something that we need to do as a movement. And I think you've really highlighted some key areas there for that. I think moving forward now, unfortunately, as I said, Bev Clarkson couldn't make it. But thank you, Sabrina Espeleta from War on One, who stepped in to fill that gap. So Sabrina, really thank you for coming in at such short notice. Sabrina's worked extensively in South America, and particularly on ensuring that food is a human right and not something that's just nice to have. So Sabrina, really looking forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And well, yes, the presentations are really interesting, and they focus on a topic that is so important. And as the previous speakers have said, food is really a political issue. I would like to bring the international perspective here, and the perspective of our partners from and the work of our partners from around the world, and they all belong to the food sovereignty movement. We're working with partners in Morocco, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and also grassroots organizations in South America that have been resisting the corporate agriculture model for decades now. So regarding the crisis, we are facing a series of multiple crises that combine more recent issues like the pandemic, but the pandemic basically has exacerbated crises that have been there for decades, basically since the Green Revolution. And these crises have put, as I highlighted even more, the inequalities that this neoliberal model of food production, which is based on monoculture, food commodification, heavy extraction of natural resources, and especially concentration of land ownership in very few hands. And you can see this in many countries abroad. One of the crises that has been coming up to today was the crisis of the prices since 2008. 2008, with the financial crisis, we have there have been new actors coming in the stock market, and they started to invest heavily in the agricultural sector, attracted by high price volatility. So they basically started speculating on the food prices. And then from a more long-term perspective, there has also been a connection of 3 decades of neoliberal policies, free trade agreements, as has also already been said, that have been affected the capacity of food production in many countries. An example, for example, is Morocco, where we are working with partners there. And there are some regions, for example, in the south of Morocco, that rely heavily on the export of crops for the European, but also the British market. Many supermarkets are buying and pre-ordering varieties and qualities and quantities of fruits, vegetables, for example, tomatoes, the strawberries, the raspberries. And these policies have been accompanied in Morocco by a series of measures on the way the crops have to be produced, so high use of natural resources, GM seeds, pesticides, but also, as it's already been said, they have applied flexible labor regulations that allow high exploitation. For example, in the south of Morocco, many fruits and vegetable farms, the majority of workers are women. The peasant minimum wage is not enough for workers that move to the urban areas. Other problems include increased private debt, hard working conditions. They work in overheated greenhouses with high humidity, exposure to dangerous pesticides with no PPE, inhuman conditions of transport from the picking point to the farms. And then the farm officials do not disclose health and safety information to the workers about the toxins that they are exposed, for example, chemical types, etc. They don't publish health and safety regulations, and so on. So our partners are working in different levels, and one of them is also workers' protection and unionizing in the workplace. This is an example of Morocco, but there are so many other examples that can say what is happening is with the COVID pandemic is that this has exacerbated even more, and we have seen that there is even more corporate influence and control on the food systems. For example, during the lockdowns in countries like Kenya, farmers' markets have been closed by the governments, and instead they gave green lights to large retailers and supermarkets, so they have lost their main income. At the same time, also the corporations are taking over new spaces of political decision making. For example, the UN Food System Summit that is taking place at the end of July and in September. New players are also coming more strong during this pandemic, like the tech corporations. We've seen in India with the Indian farmer protest, the large mobilization and national holdings and corporations, both national holdings and international corporations, are influencing the decision-making processes on a government level, like international tech companies also include Amazon and Facebook, who are very keen on gathering more data and information from the farmers, smallholder farmers, and then they tie them with technological packages, including pesticides. But at the same time, we've seen that in some countries, other partners have caught the opportunity to question this model of production. In Sri Lanka, because of the economical problems, an economic crisis provoked by the pandemic, the government has taken drastic decisions in terms of imports of pesticides and fertilizers, because the Sri Lankan agriculture depends a lot on imported chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So recently, from April of this year, they banned the imports of chemical pesticides and fertilizers. These are an impact on the smallholder farmers, but our partners are basically trying to work to push the government to bring forward the conversation for an alternative form of production that includes agroecology, and to show how important agroecology and peasant family farming are as an alternative to focus as an alternative to the current model, which is plantation-based, like tea, rubber, palm oil, etc. So peasant family farming and family farming, as already said, is basically the backbone of the production in the global south. It's a sector that feeds the world by producing over 80% of the food, but they have only 25% of the available land. So the issue of land is key in Europe, but also abroad, where there are more episodes of land grabbing since the pandemic. So what happens, how our partners are organizing under the food sovereignty movement, which has been fighting for the last 25 years. This year is 25 years since the declaration of food sovereignty at the World Food Summit in 1996. And what is important of the food sovereignty principle is that it combines different principles. The right to food, that is, as already mentioned, because it focuses on the quality food for the people. It values food providers, so the rights of the producers and all the workers that work in the chain. Localizes the food systems, so it's more focused on local food system and shorter supply and value chains, and put control over natural resources. For this is intersected with a very important right to land, and build knowledges and skills, and works with nature. So one of the core principles of the 6 principles of food sovereignty is agroecology and transition to peasant-based agroecology. We always want to focus to highlight the fact that agroecology alone is not enough. It has to be combined with the right to land, because family farmers are the ones who feed the world and not the corporations. Corporations only focus on overproduction and speculation of stocks and prices. And so I just want to say one last thing, which is how this connects with the UK reality. And I think that it's so important because the international solidarity from the UK movements, trade unions and organizations is super important. So many struggles are connected, like the issues of pesticides. There are pesticides that are banned in the UK, but they are produced in the UK and exported abroad, like in Kenya, India, Brazil. One example is the paraquat. So solidarity is very important because organizations here can also show solidarity with the workers' movements around the world and fight for the working conditions of farm workers and agricultural workers around the world. And so I believe that in order to build a strong food movement, we need to be able to connect all these dots and see that all these struggles are interconnected. And then, as an example, and here I close, the collaboration between the farmers, the peasant movements, and the trade unions led to a very important results. And one of them is that they appended the WTO meeting in Seattle and then did it again in Cancun and again in Hong Kong. So this union of different movements getting together, it can really bring a change. So this is it. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Sabrina. That was a fantastic international perspective. And I'd like to send to all the workers that you work with a message of solidarity, without a doubt, from here at the Tolpuddle Festival and from trade unions in the UK. Our last speaker, unfortunately, David, we've lost David Emery. Our last speaker is Sarah Woolley. Sarah is the General Secretary of the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union and is the first woman Secretary of that union. So Sarah, over to you, please.
Morning. Thanks, Nick, and thank you for the invitation to return and speak today on an important topic alongside a great platform from a very warm and sunny Wakefield. I wanted to give some thoughts, if I can, on the current situation in the food industry as we see it, and touch on a couple of things that we have and are going to be doing as a trade union. And I agree with what Luke said at the beginning of his contribution. Food should be more political, and we as in the general public should care more about food, what's in it, how it's distributed, and the conditions in which it is produced from farm to fork. The Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union is the only independent trade union that focuses purely on representing workers throughout the food industry. All of our officials have worked within it and have experience of the issues and the changes that have occurred over the years. We're one of the oldest trade unions in the UK at over 160 years old, and I'm incredibly proud to be the first female General Secretary we have ever had, though no one actually prepared me to take over during a global pandemic. The food industry is the biggest manufacturing unit in the UK. We are the biggest contributors to the economy, and over the last 12 months, our members have stood up as the key workers we have always known they are and kept the nation thread through the pandemic. They have had to deal with going into work day after day to make sure supermarket shelves have remained full, whilst dealing with the concerns of working in factories and shops during the pandemic, as well as massive changes to working practices designed to keep members safe as possible. And thanks in the main to our amazing health and safety reps challenging employers and making sure that solving one issue doesn't cause another. We may have seen a number of outbreaks, but thankfully we have not seen the massive death toll that other sectors or non-unionised parts of the industry have. You would think, being such a large contributor to the economy, the government would be throwing money into it as it does with other industries. Yet our industry is at the bottom of the pile when it comes to government investment, not just in terms of investing in new technologies or platforms or green initiatives, but also in the people, upskilling and educating them. Across the board, these new technologies are bought by employers rather than the industry invested in by the government out of the profits they make, reducing the amount they then invest into the people creating the profit and creating this competitive culture of who can have the biggest, shiniest machine to make the fastest number of products with the least number of people interacting with it, with what's being made, so it can be made as cheap as possible to appease the supermarkets who have far too much power in our industry and continue to use that power to turn the screws on suppliers in order to maximise their own profits. We've seen over the last few years more and more advanced kit replacing people. And I'll never forget when I was going around sites pre-pandemic, which feels like decades ago now, before the lockdown, One where an artisan, it was a bakery where artisan loaves are being made, and it was a tiny site with 100+ staff rolling bread, putting it into the prover and in and out of the oven by hand. And then I visited a much larger site. It was easily 10 times the site of the previous, 10 times the size of the previous one, sorry, with multiple lines and multiple products being made. And if I saw 30 people the whole time I was there, I'd be rounding that up. And we believe that coming out of the pandemic, more and more employers will look to further advance their automation so that should we experience more lockdowns or future pandemics, production won't be slowed as the machines can carry on. But what relying on machines does mean is if a part fails, the whole line stops, because you can't ask another part of a machine to cover 2 roles until cover arrives, which is why we still need people to produce food. You may have seen, and I know it's been mentioned a couple of times this morning already, the campaign Ian Byrne has been leading on to enshrine the right to food into legislation. And we've been proud to work with Ian and thought that it was only right that we elevate the voices of our members working in the food industry. Because people believe that, workers working in the food industry can't possibly be going hungry because they produce food for a living. So we surveyed them to find out if the pandemic had impacted their ability to access decent, nutritious food. And to be quite frank, the results were shocking. 40% of respondents told us that they have eaten less than they thought they should have during the pandemic due to a lack of money. 19% told us there had been a time during the pandemic where their household had completely run out of food due to a lack of money. Over 35% said they had gone without enough food to make sure others in the house could be fed properly, and 1 in 5 relied on food from a friend or a relative to provide meals. And even more reported that they were concerned about running out of food. Now, these are the people that have worked throughout the pandemic feeding the nation. Yet our survey is showing that food insecurity is a significant issue for workers in our industry. And worrying about not being able to feed yourself and your family should not be something anyone has to go through, let alone through a global pandemic where there's been more than enough to worry about. The report's findings are based on experiences in the most part from staff who that have not been working from home in the past year, 15 months. There are workers who have been going out every day to ensure shelves can be stocked and fridges can be filled. Workers who feel, and I quote, that the pay is terrible everywhere in these roles, but to be honest, it's not enough to cover bills and food. It's just not good enough. I'm frightened for my job security, and it's hard juggling work and homeschooling. It's really taken a toll on me mentally. And the public doesn't seem to be aware how many people, even now, don't wear masks, don't distance, don't sanitize their hands, and how we workers don't feel safe serving them. And there's so many, many more examples. No one should go without food in the 6th richest country in the world, yet shamefully too many food workers are struggling to earn enough to purchase the very food they produce. And the pandemic has shone a light on the real key workers in this country, not the bosses, the shareholders, or the millionaires, the people on the front line, those struggling to make ends meet whilst propping our country up through the toughest year any of us have ever experienced. And we can't allow them to be failed any longer. We can't sit back while people are struggling to survive. And that's why the time is right for the right to food to be enshrined in law, for decent, nutritious food to be truly accessible, affordable, healthy, safe to eat, and fairly produced by well-paid, unionised, protected staff throughout the food industry. And whilst, there were some small positive aspects to Dimbleby's national food strategy, and yes, it's a good start, with 10 million people across the UK facing food poverty, the strategy needed to bring meaningful change and recommend a right to food law. Instead, it offers little more than crumbs in the fight against hunger. And I finish on this. People talk about the food industry like it's the place to go where there's nowhere else, an industry that doesn't need skills, doesn't need a university degree, so deserves low pay and precarious contracts. Well, I'm proud to have worked in the food industry. I'm proud to have worked at Greggs. I wonder how many people can make 64 sandwiches an hour knowing the recipes off by heart, and quite sadly, I still do. I wonder how many know the correct temperature to keep sausages in a hot hold for, and how long they can do that without putting customers at risk. What to do if a fridge or a self-selector breaks down, or how many of them have the ability to crowd control queues of customers, especially at Christmas where everyone's grumpy because they're rushing around and nothing's done fast enough. I wonder if people knew the training that was required to be a mixer, to ensure the right ingredients are used and allergens that can literally kill people aren't added incorrectly, or the physical toll of standing on the end of an oven, tipping bread out of hot tins takes out on a person. How challenging it is to keep up with boxing fondant fancies or Yorkshire puddings, or even putting cherries on top of a Bakewell tart, or having the ability to know that a line isn't running just by the noise it's making, or having to clean down intricate parts of a machine to ensure that a new product can be made on it with no cross-contamination. I wonder then if they would still see our industry as unskilled, because not everyone is cut out to do these jobs. And yes, a university degree may not be needed, but one mistake can be catastrophic. So going forwards, the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union want to change the narrative about our industry. We want people to feel proud to work within it, and the wider public to understand the skills that are needed and used every day to produce the food they eat, and join us in putting pressure on the government to increase the standards in pay, terms and conditions, and of course investment as a result. We're working in the background with a group of academics on our Right to Food report and how we use that as a foundation to make changes to improve our industry in the future for the workers within it, not just the employers and the supermarkets, because our members deserve more. They've been forgotten key workers during this pandemic, and even before it came about. They are the ones that keep the nation going and fed, and we shouldn't be in a position where people in our industry are going hungry because they are paid too little to survive. Thank you.
There with my members in USDAW who work in the food sectors as well, and right through the supply chain to putting food on the shelves, and so many similar experiences there. I think all our contributions today in this debate have focused on the environment, how big business is impacting on that in a number of ways, and have also, of course, on the plight of workers and why as trade unions we must organise not only in the UK but internationally to form solidarity to improve working conditions for everybody. So I'd like to thank all our contributors today, Luke, Sabrina, Charlie and Sarah. To say unfortunately David dropped off. I'd just like to thank you. Hopefully you'll be able to go out and enjoy the sunshine. I'm hoping to escape from these air bales. Look lovely, but I'm getting bitten to death here. So